It came rattling down County Road 18 on a cold October afternoon, pulled by an old blue Ford pickup with one cracked headlight and a tailgate held shut by baling wire. Dust and dry leaves rolled behind it in a long brown wake, lifting off the ditch grass and skittering across the road like something trying to outrun winter. By the time the truck slowed in front of Whitaker Farm, 3 neighbors had already stepped out to their fences, and 2 more pickups had eased onto the shoulder just to see what Earl Whitaker was hauling home. Then the first goat lifted its head over the side rail. It was thin enough that its ribs showed through its hide. Its ears hung low. Its coat was patchy and dull. Behind it were more just like it, pressed shoulder to shoulder in that sagging trailer, 180 goats that looked like they had come from the forgotten corner of an auction yard where nobody with sense raised a hand. Earl climbed out without hurry. He was 60 years old, narrow in the shoulders but still strong in the hands, with sun-browned skin, a gray beard trimmed short, and eyes that always seemed to be measuring something no one else had noticed. He wore the same sweat-darkened cap he had worn for years, the one with the feed store logo faded almost white. He did not look at the men watching from the road. He did not wave. He only opened the gate, backed the trailer toward the old cattle lot, and began unloading the sickliest herd anyone in that county had seen in a long time. The goats stepped down into weeds taller than their backs. That was what made folks shake their heads. Whitaker Farm was not short on trouble. The barn roof had rusted through in 2 places. The fences leaned as if tired of standing. The old International tractor sat behind the machine shed with its hood open and a 5-gallon bucket under the leaking oil pan. The north pasture, once the pride of Earl's father, had been swallowed by bramble, thistle, honeysuckle, and multiflora rose. Vines crawled over the fence posts. Thorn canes blocked the cattle paths. The few cows Earl still owned had stopped grazing half the ground because there was nothing soft left worth eating. And Earl, with the bank breathing down his neck, had spent the last of his auction money on goats nobody else wanted. By sundown, half the town knew. By morning, everyone did. Whitaker Farm had been in Earl's family for nearly 80 years. His grandfather had bought the first 40 acres with money saved from tobacco, corn, and odd jobs fixing neighbors' equipment. Earl's father had added another 30 acres after the war and built the long cattle barn by hand, setting each post with a shovel, a level, and stubborn pride. For decades, the Whitaker place had carried good beef, clean hay, and dark grass that stayed green longer than most fields in dry weather. But land remembers both care and neglect. Earl had spent most of his adult life working part-time at the grain elevator and helping his father on evenings and weekends. When his father's lungs went bad, everything slowed at once. Fences went unrepaired. Tired pastures were grazed too hard because there was no money to rest them, and the rising cost of fertilizer, diesel, seed, and feed turned every repair into a choice between one problem and another. Then came 2 weak calf crops, a failed hay season, and a spring so wet that the tractor got buried to its axles near the lower creek crossing. By the time Earl buried his father behind the little white church outside town, the farm was already sliding toward the edge. The bank gave him until the next summer to show a plan that could become real income, not a dream, not a family story, not a promise about someday, but numbers that could be written on paper and defended across a desk. Earl had sat in a paneled office that smelled like coffee and printer ink, while the loan officer explained, in the polished tone of a man trying to sound kind, that sentiment could not service debt. The Whitaker place still had value as land. Someone would buy it. Earl could sell while there was still dignity left, or he could wait until the bank forced the matter. Earl had folded the letter twice, put it in his shirt pocket, and driven home without turning on the radio. For 3 days, he walked the farm. He walked the north pasture where the cows had stopped going. He walked the creek bank where honeysuckle shaded the ground so thick that no grass grew underneath. He walked the old hayfield where thistleheads stood silver in the sun. He kneeled in the dirt and pressed it between his fingers. It was pale and tired, crusted on top, dry under the surface, with roots too shallow to hold moisture. He stood in the same fields where his father had once cut hay so thick that windrows looked like green walls, and he listened to flies buzz over weeds the cattle would not touch. Then he hitched the trailer and went to an auction 2 counties over. The goats were the last lot of the day. Nobody wanted them. They had been poorly kept, underfed, wormy, and wild-eyed from too much hauling. The auctioneer moved fast because the room had already lost interest. Earl stood beside the rail, studying them the way another man might study a field before rain. He saw the thin hips and rough coats, but he also saw mouths made for brush, quick feet, hard stomachs, and a hunger that could turn thorn and vine into manure. He bought them cheap. That was the part people heard. They did not hear what he had found in his father's kitchen drawer 2 nights before. It was a small black notebook, its cardboard cover soft from years of use, the pages curled at the corners. Earl had seen it before as a boy, but had never read it closely. His father had written in it through the 1970s and early 1980s, back when the pastures were still young and the county agent used to hold soil meetings in church basements. Most of the notes were plain observations: rainfall, frost dates, calf weights, hay yields, what grew well after a wet spring, and what failed after a dry August. But one page had stopped Earl cold. His father had written about goats. Not many. Just a few borrowed from Earl's grandfather after a bad brush year. The note said the goats had cleaned the creek bank better than any mower, stripped the honeysuckle low enough for sunlight to reach the ground, and knocked back briars that cattle had avoided for years. Under that page, written in pencil so faded Earl had to hold it under the kitchen lamp, was one sentence: "Brush steals grass before drought ever gets a chance." Earl read that line over and over. He remembered being 8 years old, standing barefoot at the edge of the old lot, watching his grandfather's goats climb over brush piles and eat leaves off thorny canes like they were sweet feed. He remembered the north pasture before it turned wild, remembered grass so deep it hid his boots, remembered his father saying that land did not go bad all at once. It went bad, one ignored corner at a time. So Earl made his plan. He was not buying goats to look rich, to chase a trend, or to pretend he had found some easy cure for worn-out land. He was buying time for the soil. He was buying a living tool cheap enough for a broke man to use. If the goats could weaken the brush through fall and early spring, if sunlight could reach the ground before the warm season, if their manure and trampling could begin feeding the tired surface through winter, then the native grasses might have a chance to return by summer. That was the secret nobody at the diner understood. At the diner, they only saw foolishness. Through the first weeks of November, Earl's name was passed around with coffee cups and breakfast plates. Men who had not set foot on his farm in years suddenly had opinions about it. Some said his father would have known better, others treated goats as proof that a man had already given up on cattle, and a few quietly calculated how cheaply the back acres might sell once the bank stepped in. At the feed store, a clerk shook his head, while Earl paid for mineral blocks and wormer, with cash he could hardly spare. On the road, neighbors slowed their trucks just enough to watch him drag cattle panels through weeds that scratched his arms bloody. Earl heard enough of it. He heard it when he stood in line for diesel, when he patched fence near the road and voices carried from passing pickups, and when the county agent came by to look at the thin goats with the careful expression people use when they are trying not to insult a dying man. Earl kept his face still, but the words did not pass through him as cleanly as people thought. They collected somewhere under his ribs. For a while he swallowed them. He divided the north pasture into small sections with temporary electric fence. He hauled water in a dented tank because the old line to the back field was clogged with roots. He mixed loose minerals in rubber tubs and treated the sickest animals first. He trimmed hooves, checked eyelids, learned which goats pushed forward and which ones needed watching. When a weak doe went down in the first week, he carried her to the barn himself, laid her on clean straw, and sat with her past midnight while rain tapped the tin roof above him. The first month nearly broke him. The goats escaped twice. Once they got through a weak corner and spread along the ditch like smoke, eating blackberry leaves, while Earl and an old dog named June tried to turn them back before dark. Another time, wind knocked a limb across the fence, and by dawn, 27 goats were standing on the wrong side of the creek, calm as church ladies, stripping leaves from saplings. Earl spent that whole morning in mud up to his ankles, rebuilding fence, while cold rain slid down the back of his coat. Then came the day his patience cracked. It happened after a neighbor slowed his pickup by the gate and stared too long. Earl had just found 2 goats tangled in a roll of loose wire, one limping, the other bleeding from a shallow cut along its flank. The electric fence had shorted out again, the water tank had sprung a leak, and the bank letter in his shirt pocket had gone soft from rain and sweat. When the truck rolled past, and the driver lifted 2 fingers in a lazy little salute, Earl snapped. He threw the fence pliers so hard they struck the gatepost and bounced into the mud. For one wild moment, he stood in the field, breathing like a man who had run uphill, his hands shaking, his jaw locked, his eyes wet with fury he would never have admitted to anyone. He cursed the goats, the bank, the weeds, the dead tractor, the men at the diner, and even the old notebook that had dragged him into believing memory could stand up against debt. Then he kicked the broken water tank, hard enough to dent it, and the hollow sound rolled across the pasture like a gunshot. The goats went still. So did Earl. The anger drained out of him slowly, leaving only shame and exhaustion. He looked at the limping goat, then at the torn wire, then at the gray sky pressing down on the farm his father had left him. For the first time since buying the herd, he did not feel wise or stubborn or quietly certain. He felt foolish. He felt old. He felt like a man trying to hold a barn door shut in a tornado. That night, he almost quit. He sat at the kitchen table after midnight while the house settled around him. His father's notebook lay open beside the bank letter. Rain that had been steady all day tapped against the window, and beyond the glass the dark outline of the barn looked smaller than he remembered. Earl looked at the numbers again and again until they blurred. Maybe he had confused memory with wisdom. Maybe old notes could not save new debt. Maybe the farm had already ended, and he was just too stubborn to admit it. Then his eyes fell on that faded pencil line again. Brush steals grass before drought ever gets a chance. Before dawn, he was back outside. Winter did not reward him quickly. The fields did not turn green by Christmas. The soil did not soften in some pretty sudden way. For months, the north pasture looked worse to anyone driving by. The goats lowered the brush, stripped leaves, broke vines, and left behind stems, mud, manure, and rough-looking patches that made the whole field seem wounded. Neighbors saw brown canes and trampled ground, and thought the goats had finished what debt had started. Earl saw something different, but even he had to look closely. He saw where honeysuckle no longer cast a mat of shade over the soil. He saw frost reach ground that had not seen winter light in years. He saw manure pellets slowly darken and break under rain. He saw old thistle heads disappear before they could seed another generation. He saw bramble canes weakened by repeated browsing, not killed in a week, not magically erased, but pushed back hard enough to give grass a fighting chance. Through January and February, he kept rotating the goats when the ground allowed it, and resting the worst areas when mud threatened to do more harm than good. He learned to leave residue on the surface instead of chasing a clean-looking field. He hauled hay to the goats when ice sealed the brush, kept bedding deep in the barn for the weakest animals, and used every dry afternoon to repair fence. His hands cracked from cold, his knees ached. The old dog followed him more slowly each week. By March, the first signs appeared. Not enough to impress the road watchers, not enough to change the bank's mind, but in the protected strips near the creek, where goats had opened the brush canopy in November, small blades began to rise through dead stems. Clover showed in low spots. Orchard grass returned in thin lines along old root crowns. The soil, once sealed under shade and vine litter, held the spring rain a little longer. Earthworms appeared beneath boards and flattened hay. Earl marked each sign in the notebook, careful not to exaggerate what was still fragile. In April, he made his first money from the goats. A widow outside town had 5 acres behind her barn, swallowed by thistle and blackberry, and she did not want chemical spray near her well. Earl hauled 30 goats there for 10 days, set portable fence, and charged just enough to cover feed, fuel, and a little toward the loan. Then an apple grower east of town asked whether goats could work under trees without tearing up roots. Earl took a smaller group, watched them carefully, moved them fast, and came home with another check folded in his shirt pocket. It was not rescue money. It was proof of life. The bank did not care about proof of life. Not yet. In May, Earl was called back to the office. The same paneled room waited for him. The same smell of coffee and printer ink. The same polished desk with his father's farm reduced to folders, numbers, and legal descriptions. This time, the loan officer did not speak with false kindness. The bank had reviewed the account. The overdue balance remained serious. The seasonal income Earl reported was not enough to satisfy the note. If the summer did not produce a larger payment, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Earl sat there with his cap in his hands, mud still dried along the cuffs of his jeans. Across the desk, the loan officer slid papers toward him with clean fingers. There were options, all of them dressed in professional language, and all of them meaning the same thing. Sell a portion, bring in a buyer, liquidate livestock, stop waiting for land that had already failed to become something it had not been in years. For the first time in that office, Earl felt anger rise again. Not loud anger, not the kind that throws tools at a gatepost. This was colder, steadier, and harder to swallow. The man across from him did not know the north pasture before the brush. He did not know Earl's father's hands, or the smell of fresh hay in that barn, or what it meant to watch a field start breathing again after years of being choked. To the bank, the farm was collateral. To Earl, it was the last language his family had left behind. But Earl still did not argue. He gathered the papers, stood, and left with 30 days to bring in a payment large enough to stop the process. That was when summer turned cruel. By early June, the rain stopped. One dry week became 2, then 4, then 6. The creek thinned to a slow brown ribbon between exposed stones. Dust rose from gravel roads and settled on mailbox flags. Corn leaves curled tight in fields across the county. Cattle gathered at pond edges, standing in mud that shrank each day. Hay prices jumped so fast that men stopped joking at the feed store and started doing math on receipt paper. By the 45th day without meaningful rain, pastures around Mill Creek had turned the color of old rope. The farmers with clean-looking fields suffered first because their cattle had grazed the soft grass close in May, and without rain, it had nothing left to rebuild from. The brushy fields suffered in a different way. There was green there, but not the kind cows could use. Vines and thorn bushes stayed alive while the grass under them disappeared. Men who had laughed at Earl began hauling hay in midsummer, paying high prices for bales they usually did not need until winter. Earl's farm was under the same sky. Nothing about his place was spared from heat. The ground cracked in the open spots. The goats needed water every day. The remaining cows bawled at empty shade in the afternoon. Every decision now mattered. If the goats had weakened the land instead of healing it, the drought would expose him. If he had guessed wrong, there would be no hiding from it. The whole valley would see the Whitaker place fail. But in the rotated strips behind the old barn, something held. It was not lush at first. It was not the miracle green of a seed catalog. It was quieter than that. The areas browsed in fall and rested through winter had deeper cover, more broken plant litter, and enough returning root growth to protect the surface. The soil under the manure and dead vine stems did not crust as hard. In the mornings, dew gathered low in those paddocks while the road ditch was already dry. Clover spread in small patches. Orchard grass that had slept under years of shade sent up pale green blades and stayed alive when other fields crisped at the tips. Then, after one brief storm dropped less than half an inch of rain, the difference became impossible to ignore. Across the road, a neighbor's pasture stayed brown except for weeds. Earl's restored strips flushed green within a week. People slowed their trucks again. This time, They were not laughing. The goats had changed too. The thin animals that had stumbled off the trailer in October now moved with bright eyes and full bellies. Their coats had begun to shine. They climbed brush piles, pushed through vine tangles, and worked the worst ground with a hunger that looked almost purposeful. Earl began separating the strongest does and marking the healthier kids. What had looked like a dying herd in the fall had become an asset by summer. The first desperate neighbor came at dusk. He was a cattleman from the ridge, one of the men who had treated goats like a poor man's last mistake. His south lot was overrun with bramble, and his cows were losing weight. He stood by Earl's gate for a long minute, looking across the paddocks where green still clung to the ground. Earl did not make him beg. Within a week, 40 goats were working that man's 15 acres under portable fence, eating the brush cattle had walked around for years. Then came the apple grower, who needed the orchard rows cleaned again before harvest. Then a horse farm that needed a creek bank cleared without spraying herbicide near the water. Then 2 cattlemen who had watched their hay bills double and suddenly understood that weeds were not just an eyesore, they were stolen pasture. Earl charged less than a contractor and more than charity. He hauled the goats in the same battered trailer that had made the county laugh, and every trip put money against the banknote. The herd worked other farms while his own restored strips rested. The goats turned brush into income, and the recovering pasture kept his remaining cattle from needing as much purchased hay. By the end of July, Earl had the payment. He drove to the bank on a Friday afternoon with sweat dried into his shirt and dust on the dashboard. The check in his pocket had weight to it, not because it was enough to make him rich, but because every dollar had come from the thing people had mocked. Brush grazing income, goat leases, a small sale of healthy kids, reduced hay costs that left cash where there would have been another bill. Inside the bank, the loan officer looked up as Earl entered. This time, Earl did not sit until he was asked. He placed the check on the desk, then laid beside it a folder of receipts, grazing agreements, photos from October, photos from March, photos from July, and a handwritten pasture map showing which sections had been browsed, rested, and recovered. The loan officer's face changed slowly as he turned each page. The first look was caution. The second was surprise. By the time he reached the photograph of the north pasture, green under the same drought that had browned the county around it, his mouth had tightened into the expression of a man realizing the numbers on his desk had missed something living. The room went quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Earl stood across from him, cap in hand, the same man who had been told to sell while there was still dignity left. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for praise. He only waited while the banker compared the check to the overdue balance, then compared the new income records to the old assumptions in the file. For a long moment, the future of Whitaker Farm sat between them. The bank could still make things hard. Earl knew that. One payment did not erase years of pressure, but this payment changed the shape of the conversation. The farm was no longer just failing land waiting for liquidation. It had a working plan, a new income line, a pasture recovery strategy, and proof that the worst ground on the place could earn before it looked pretty. When the loan officer finally stamped the receipt, the sound cracked through the office like a small hammer striking iron. Earl picked it up, folded it once, and placed it in his shirt pocket. By August, the county agent came back on a morning already hot before 9. This time, he did not stand by the road with a doubtful face. He walked the field beside Earl, boots sinking slightly into soil that had softened under cover, manure, shade, and returning roots. He bent down and pulled back a mat of dead vine stems. Underneath, young grass threaded through darkening soil. Earthworms moved where Earl had not seen many in years. The agent took pictures. He studied the portable fencing, the water points, the rest periods, the browse height, the parasite rotation, and the way Earl used goats ahead of cattle instead of treating them as a separate miracle. Earl answered simply. He did not boast. He did not remind the man of his first visit. He opened his father's notebook and showed the old page, now surrounded by his own notes in darker ink. By fall, Whitaker Farm looked different. Not perfect, not rich. The barn roof still needed work. The tractor still smoked. There were still bills, repairs, and long mornings when frost silvered the fence wire and Earl's hands ached before sunrise. But the north pasture had opened. The creek bank could breathe. Native grass had returned in uneven but living patches. The goats had become part of the farm's rhythm, moving ahead of the cattle, clearing what the cows could not use, turning weeds into fertility and brush into cash. The same people who had laughed now came to look. They stood at the fence, quieter than before, watching the animals work through thorns without complaint. Some asked questions, some only nodded. A few admitted they had never thought of weeds as stored feed, or goats as a way to buy time for tired land. Earl never made them feel small for being wrong. He knew the land had done the teaching. He had only stayed with it long enough for the lesson to show. The next spring, the first strong flush of grass rose across the north pasture. It came in thickest where the goats had passed the previous fall, where sunlight had returned months earlier, where manure had broken down through winter, where roots had been given time to begin again. Earl turned his remaining cattle onto the recovered strips for a short graze, then moved them off before they could take too much. He had learned restraint from the hardest year of his life. Saving a farm, he now understood, was not one big victory but 100 small decisions made when no one believed they mattered. On a clear morning in May, Earl stood by the old gate with his father's notebook resting on the hood of the blue Ford. The goats were scattered across a fresh paddock, bells clicking softly as they worked through a wall of honeysuckle. Beyond them, the pasture rolled green toward the creek. The same road where neighbors had slowed to laugh now carried trucks that slowed for a different reason. Men looked over the fence and saw not a fool's mistake, but a farm coming back to life, one strip at a time. Earl picked up his pencil and wrote a new line beneath his father's faded one. The goats bought us another year, and the grass is answering. He closed the notebook and looked toward the barn his father had built, the fields his grandfather had cleared, and the land that had almost slipped away under debt, drought, and doubt. He had not saved it by arguing at the diner. He had not saved it by proving himself in words. He had saved it by watching what the land was trying to say, by trusting old wisdom when everyone else called it foolish, and by getting up before dawn even after the night he had nearly broken under the weight of it all. Whitaker Farm was not just a place he managed anymore. It was a promise kept. And in Mill Creek County, whenever someone saw a patch of weeds where grass ought to be, they no longer laughed first. They thought of Earl Whitaker, the old man who bought 180 sickly goats when everybody said he was finished, and proved that sometimes the thing a farm needs most is not more money, newer machines, or louder confidence. Sometimes it needs a man quiet enough to listen. Sometimes it needs the wisdom everyone else forgot. And sometimes the weeds that look like the end are only the beginning of the farm coming back.